Thank you for inviting me to give this talk. This is a great honor. I'm actually going to show you a slideshow, which will not be as impressive as the graphics we just saw, but it hopefully will help you follow what I'm saying. Right, so I'm going to be talking about Al-Farabi. So obviously he is a philosopher who you're all well acquainted with. He lived in the 9th and 10th centuries of the Christian calendar and the 3rd and 4th centuries of the Islamic calendar. And he's one of the most important philosophers and scientists of Islamic history, and is particularly important for his reception and interpretation of Greek philosophy. So I think there are two main reasons why he's important in terms of his influence. One is that he was very influential on a later philosopher whose name is Ibn Sina, who I'm sure you all know of. So this is Avicenna, who died in 1037, according to the Christian calendar. And because Avicenna, or Ibn Sina, is the most important and influential philosopher, full stop, in the Islamic world, a lot of Farabi's ideas come through Ibn Sina into the later Islamic tradition. So for example, in this talk, I'll say something about Al-Farabi's idea about how God creates the world by emanating it through the heavenly spheres. And this is an idea that Avicenna, Ibn Sina, picks up from Al-Farabi. And furthermore, Farabi's works, some of them, were translated into Latin and had a dramatic influence on philosophy in the Latin Christian European culture. So he's very influential on the future in both the Islamic world and in Christian Europe. In addition to that, he's important for the reception of earlier philosophy in the Arabic-speaking world. He was not someone who translated works from Greek himself, but he interpreted Greek philosophy and wrote commentaries on the works of Greek philosophers, especially Aristotle. He also uses ideas from other Greek philosophers like Plato. And I think because of that, especially in some European scholarship on Farabi, it used to be thought that he's really only important because he transmits ideas from the Greeks to the later tradition. But actually, he's a very innovative thinker. And even in his commentaries on Aristotle, he has original and important things to say, as we'll see in a second. And he also wrote independent treatises. So in other words, works that are not commentaries, where he puts forth his own ideas. So he's always inspired by Greek philosophy, especially by Aristotle, but he's also inspired by other things. So obviously, especially Islam and the Quran. And he has a lot of his own ideas, which he uses in explaining Greek philosophy, or which were inspired by Greek philosophy, but that go further. And I want to give you 3 examples of this. And in each case, you'll see that it has something to do with Greek philosophy, but it's also new. And I'm going to talk about 3 areas of his thoughts, just to kind of cover as much of his contribution as I can. And I'll talk about topics that are drawn from his logic, his metaphysics, and his politics. So in logic, I want to focus on a very specific problem, which was raised by Aristotle in one of his logical writings. And Farabi wrote a commentary on this treatise of logic by Aristotle. The Aristotelian work is called On Interpretation, Perihemeneus. And the question is this: if it's true right now that something will happen in the future, does that mean that the thing that happens in the future is necessary? So let me give you an example. Suppose that, this is actually Aristotle's example, suppose that there will be a sea battle tomorrow. And it's already true now that there will be a sea battle. So maybe in the Mediterranean Sea, there will be a big battle, lots of ships fighting each other, right? And this will happen tomorrow. That's the event that we're interested in, but it's true now that this will happen tomorrow. So now on Thursday, it's true that it will happen on Friday. So Aristotle's worry is this: if it's already true now that the sea battle will happen tomorrow, then it looks like it's inevitable or unavoidable that it will happen tomorrow, right? Because it's already true, right? So if it's already true now that there will be a sea battle tomorrow, then, for example, the generals and politicians who are deciding whether to have a sea battle, whether to launch a war against each other, they're kind of wasting their time. They don't need to think about it because it's already true that the battle will happen, right? So all of their deliberations can only ever result in the battle occurring. And this is true, of course, for any future event. So for example, if I'm going to have an egg tomorrow for breakfast, and if it's already true now that I will have an egg tomorrow for breakfast, even though I hadn't even thought about it yet, even the fact that it's true now that I'll have an egg tomorrow for breakfast means that I cannot avoid eating the egg. Okay? And that's very strange, right? Because you would think that we deliberate and decide and sort of ponder what we should do in the future. And this argument seems to show that the fact that there's already present truths about the future means that the future is already necessary. It's everything that will happen is inevitable and determinate. So this, just to give you a further idea of why this is so strange, it seems like there should be a difference between saying something like there will be a sea battle tomorrow, or I will eat an egg tomorrow on the one hand, and saying something like tomorrow 2 plus 2 will equal 4, because 2 plus 2 equals 4 is necessary, whereas my eating an egg is not necessary and the sea battles happening is not necessary. So, like I say, Farabi wrote a commentary on this work by Aristotle in which he gives a new solution to the problem, which I think had not been suggested by the ancient commentators on Aristotle who wrote in Greek, and I think is not also the same as Aristotle's solution. So Farabi says that although there is necessity involved here, the necessity does not apply to the future event. So he says, look, if it's true now that there will be a sea battle tomorrow, then it necessarily follows that there will be a sea battle. But that doesn't mean that the sea battle itself is necessary, because the present truth isn't necessary. So it just happens to be true that there will be a sea battle tomorrow. What that means is that there will just happen to be a sea battle tomorrow, but not necessarily, because the truth isn't necessary. The only necessity involved is that if it's true, then the sea battle will happen. So that's a little bit complicated, but I think it's actually the right solution. So he gives a really nice explanation of how truths about the future correspond to future events. So that's my first example. The second example comes from metaphysics. So obviously, Farabi believes in God, and he's a Muslim. But when he talks about God, he doesn't write from a religious or Islamic point of view. So he does not quote the Quran. In fact, I think he never even mentions Islam explicitly in his writings. He does allude to Islam frequently, but he is not a religious writer in any sense. So he never comments on passages from the Quran, which some other philosophers do. So for example, Al-Kindi, who's an earlier philosopher, and even Ibn Sina, who's not usually thought of as being very religious, they mention passages from the Quran and talk about how philosophers can understand the Quranic revelation. Farabi does not do that. But he does talk about God, obviously, and he has a very specific idea about how God relates to the world. He thinks that God is the first cause of all things, which is not surprising, but he also thinks that God only relates to things in a mediated way. So what that means is that God uses intermediaries to create everything. And basically the idea here is that God will create the heavenly bodies, in particular the heavenly bodies that are furthest away from the earth. And then these heavenly bodies will cause things to happen lower down and ultimately in our world. So you could think about this as saying that God creates the most important and highest things that are further away from us, but he doesn't directly create the things that happen in our world. So for example, God doesn't directly create you or me. What creates you and me is basically the heavenly bodies and the angels that move the heavenly bodies. Furthermore, he thinks that this whole process is necessary. So here necessity comes in again. So he thinks that God gives rise to the universe the way that a light would give off illumination, or the way that a fountain overflows with water. And this is an idea that he takes from Greek Neoplatonic ideas from late antiquity. And he uses the word phaid, which means emanation, to describe this. This is a very different way of thinking about God than you might think you could take out of the Quran, because the Quran sounds like it's describing God as a creator who just decides to create the world, probably at some moment in time. And Farabi describes God instead as this necessary emanating cause, which automatically gives rise to the universe, and in fact only directly relates to the highest celestial existing things, rather than to things down here around us. But of course, he still thinks that everything does come from God. So God is the first ultimate cause of everything. It's just that he uses intermediary causes to cause most things. And I think this is interesting because it shows him using Greek science and philosophy to understand what creation means. So you could think of it as a very rationalist approach to God and creation, in which he's trying to say, if you use human reason, you can understand how God relates to the world. And there's good evidence from, as I say, although he doesn't talk about the Quran itself explicitly, there's good reason to think that he would say that this is really what the Quran means. So the Quran uses sort of metaphorical language and symbols to explain how God relates to the world. But what's really going on is this necessary emanation of everything from God, like a light emanating the universe. And just to say a bit more about that, let's move on to the third topic I wanted to discuss before wrapping up, which is his ideas about political philosophy. So Farabi here is drawing especially on ideas that he takes from Plato, and above all, Plato's famous treatise called The Republic. In the Republic, Plato argues that the best philosopher for the city would be, the best ruler for a city would be a philosopher, because it's only the philosopher who has wisdom and is able to understand the nature of justice and truth and goodness and so on. And Farabi agrees with all that. So he thinks that there should be ideally, there should be one ruler of the community. And he says that this could be a city or it could be a larger nation. Like, for example, the Abbasid Caliphate, which is the political organization he lives within. That's the state in his own time. So he thinks that there should be one ruler who would be the Caliph in his lifetime. And this ruler, ideally, should have wisdom and knowledge that he uses in order to rule the rest of society. And he explicitly compares this to what I was just saying before. So he thinks that God relates to the universe the way that this perfect, ideal, wise philosopher ruler relates to the rest of the state or the rest of the community. So God is the first cause for everything in the universe. The ruler is the first ruler over everything that happens in the state or in society. And the best state or best society will have a ruler who governs in such a way that everyone who lives in the society will become virtuous. So Farabi would compare the role of God to the role of the ruler because they both exercise a kind of providence or wise governing over the thing that they govern. So God providentially rules the whole universe so that the heavens move in the correct ways so as to bring about everything that we see here in nature in our world, like the reproduction of animals and plants and the whole of nature that we can investigate via science. All of that is traced back indirectly to God's providence. And similarly, everything that happens in the ideal society will be traced back to this perfect first ruler who governs that society the way that God governs the universe. And to some extent, that all is very similar to what we might find in Greek philosophy, especially in Platonism. But Farabi makes at least one very important change to this, which is that the ideal ruler, and of course here he originally has in mind not really the Caliph, but the Prophet Muhammad, the ideal ruler should be a prophet like Muhammad was, and not only a philosopher ruler. And the reason for this is that by having prophecy, the ruler will be able to present his knowledge and wisdom and ideas to the rest of society in the form of revelation. And they will be able to accept his ideas without necessarily understanding them very well through revelation. So effectively what Farabi says is that there's kind of two ways of understanding the truth. There's philosophy, which gives you proofs and demonstrations of the truth and why everything is true. And then there's a way of approaching the truth for non-philosophers, so people who do not have their own wisdom and rational understanding. And these people get revelation, so they get the Quran. So this is, you might think this is kind of strange or even offensive from a Muslim point of view, because it sounds like he's saying that religion is lower than philosophy or is only like an inferior version of philosophy, but that's not what he's saying. What he's saying is actually that the Quran, or revelation in general, is just a different way of presenting the same truths. And these ideas will actually be echoed later on in Islamic history by another philosopher named Ibn Rushd, who in Latin and English was called Averroes, who is another commentator on Aristotle who lived in the 12th century. So this is a very bold idea that Farabi is presenting, and you can see that it fits with the picture I've painted of him in general. So he takes Greek science and philosophy, and he tries to use it to create a completely rational account of the universe and human society, which is supposed to agree with, I think, the Islamic revelation, but in a way is supposed to show why the Islamic revelation is fundamentally true. So he puts reason and scientific inquiry at the heart of his project. And I think that that's really why he is so important in the history of Islamic thought, or even the history of human thought, that he's one of the, especially in the medieval period, he's one of the most explicitly rationalist, scientific-minded thinkers that we know of who lived between late antiquity and modern times. Okay, I think that was about 20 minutes, so I'll stop there. Thank you very much.